Shalom everyone, and welcome back to the Pilgrim Youth channel. My name is Elizabeth Inicio, and today we will continue analyzing the next chapter in the book of Matthew, but in Hebrew known as Matityahu, in our series of the Brit Hadasha, commonly known as the Gospels. The title of the study is called Blessed Are Those Who Are the Salt and Light of This World, and it is based in chapter 5 of Matthew. In this chapter, we will learn the teachings of Yeshua and how he, in his ministry, in his testimony, fulfilled the prophecy that was written about him from the times of the Torah, spoken and referred to by the prophets, and illustrated through various analogies throughout scripture and in the Psalms. We locate ourselves in the first century where all of what we're going to be reading, it was taking place. And the exhortation or the understanding that we as believers must pay close attention to Yeshua's words, because he was the chosen of the Heavenly Father to make the Father's will known to all humanity. In this chapter, we will also learn about many different commandments that were given by the Eternal to Moshe and their correct interpretation for us as believers to learn and to follow. We're going to learn about very important instructions that help us live a life that the Father approves of and helps us to live a life in fullness in His presence. And with this short introduction, we will start analyzing from verse 1 to 12, and verse 1 and 2 says the following. Now when Yeshua saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and began to teach them, saying. Well, before we start in the verses, from verse 3 all the way to 12, we see, or the context of this chapter begins with a very profound teaching that we will see of Yeshua about those who he and the Father considers blessed in the eyes of the Eternal. In the first century, there were many religious sects, many religious cults that taught that being blessed implied being the most devout in practicing liturgies, having prestigious positions of power, or in that time in the Jerusalem courts, and going to the most recognized religious schools, or being wealthy materially, etc. Yeshua starts off by saying that a person that is truly blessed or happy, as some translations put it, are those who are, in verse 3 says, poor in spirit, or ruach, for theirs is the kingdom of Elohim. We can ask ourselves then, who are the poor in spirit? These believers are represented by having humble, or having characteristics that are humble, brokenhearted, in whom there is no arrogance or pride, and who submit to the will of the Eternal to carry it out. We can find this confirmed in Isaiah chapter 66 verse 2 that says the following. Has not my hand made all these things, and so they came into being, declares the Eternal? These are the ones I look on with favor, those who are humble and contrite in spirit, and who tremble at my word. So we see here how Yeshua first of all starts to say that those who are in poor of spirit that does not mean that they were poor because they were depressed, or they were not, or their spirits were down because of the challenges of this world, but rather it was contrite, or it was brokenhearted because of the things that they see in this world, and they ask for the Eternal to bring his mercy, ask the Eternal to bring his kingdom, so all of the suffering that happens in the world can stop. In verse 4, it continues to say, those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. We see here that blessed are those who suffer and are hurt by the evil that is in this world. This produces mourning, it produces mourning because of the things that we lose, or the believer loses along the way, for staying truthful by being faithful to the eternal, receiving reproach and rejection because they do not follow the path of the disobedient who are cursed. However, despite their afflictions, Yeshua says that they will receive the comfort of the eternal. How? By inheriting the celestial promise and being worthy of living in eternity. As it says in John 16, verse 33, Yeshua said the following: I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So we see here that although there might be conflicts, because in life we will want to be faithful to the eternal, which will go against the current, will go against the masses. Yeshua lets his disciples and all of those that were listening to him and to us today know that we will be going through these things, but to be comforted in his peace, to be comforted in knowing the truth that will set us free. In verse 5, it continues to say, those who are the meek, they shall inherit the earth. The meek are represented in those who, with quietness and patience, wait on the eternal and in the fulfillment of his promises. For their patience, Yeshua says, they will inherit the earth. What land will they inherit? The heavenly homeland, that new land where the eternal resides and justice dwells. Yeshua talks about the celestial dwellings talks about the dwellings before he ascended. He told his disciples that he was going to prepare a place. And Peter, in 2 Peter chapter 3 from verse 13 to 14, he reiterates the same message, saying, but in keeping with his promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth where righteousness dwells. So then, dear brothers, since you are looking forward to this, make every effort to be found spotless, blameless, and at peace with him. In verse 6, it continues to say, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. These represent those souls who love justice and strongly oppose to all the unjust and cruel actions and acts committed in the world. Yeshua says that they will see the justice of the Almighty happen, as it says also in Psalms 9 from verse 7 to 8, that says, the eternal reigns forever. He has established his throne for judgment. He rules the world in righteousness and judges the people with equity. Moving on to verse 7, it continues to say, blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. What is this merciful person like? Someone who is fair, who does not show favoritism or biases, and a person who treats others as he or she would like to be treated, who help those in need, and who are always willing to serve and show kindness to their neighbors without any convenience or interest for their own behalf. In verse 8, it continues to say, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see Elohim. What does it mean to have a clean heart? A clean heart and or a clean mind is not to have any hatred, resentment, bitterness, or hypocrisy, but instead is based in the truth and in integrity. It is not only about having beautiful emotions, but acting with righteousness, turning away from the transgressions, passions, and seeking holiness and purity. As Psalms chapter 24 from verse 3 to 5 says the following, who may ascend the mountain of the eternal? Who may stand in his holy place? The one who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not trust in an idol or swear by a false god. They will receive blessings from the eternal and vindication from the eternal, their Savior. In verse 9, it continues to say, Yeshua continues to say, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of Elohim. They are those who strive to be at peace with the Creator by obeying Him, denying themselves, and who have a clear conscience before the Father, and therefore are reconciliated to Him. as we see it in Romans 5, verse 10 to 11. Those who receive a complete shalom that surpasses all understanding and allowing them to live fully. And in turn, they have peace with their neighbors, always employing the Eternal's justice and will. The words of Yeshua should not be confused with the humanism that we see today, where they say, well, we're trying to look for world peace, but it's actually referring to the peace that as individuals we have with the Creator when we come back in Teshuvah and live a correct life before Him. We're going to move to verse 10. It says, "Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of the heavens, a kingdom of heaven." This represents those who are reproached and persecuted for doing what is right and persevere in doing good before the Creator, always putting the will of the Eternal before any man on this earth, but who have a great reward in heaven. As it says in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3 to 5, that says the following: "For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They are surprised that you do not join them in their wickedness, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. But they will have to give account to Him who is ready to judge the living and the dead." So we see here how when we choose to abstain from all of the idolatry, all of the pagan practices, as the verse says, we will receive this retaliation from these people. But the Eternal says that He is the one who's going to bring upon a judgment, who will set things straight for the just. In verse 11, it continues to say, "Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely on account of me." The life of the emissaries, and not only the emissaries, but the prophets as well, and all of those great examples that we have throughout Scripture, perhaps not in the same way, because we know that in the time of the Torah and the time of the prophets and the Psalms, Yeshua was more like a shadow signaling to this time actually that we're reading upon in the first century, when His arrival would come. And although the emissaries and the prophets lived in different times of history, both of them have all of these great people that we read about in Scriptures have always had this characteristic of having perseverance. Despite everything that they suffer, despite whatever they had to lose, for example, Abraham, who had to move away from his family, from all of the world that he knew, to come to a place where he didn't even know, or Moshe, who grew up in a palace and had to leave all of that behind to come into the service of the Eternal, or Job, who lost all of his family as well. We see that constantly this is what happens when true tzaddikim, true people who apart themselves from the wickedness of this world, live through. So here Yeshua is saying the same thing, right? Where now the emissaries who actually saw Yeshua, who actually they were witnesses, physical witnesses, were able to listen to these words that Yeshua was telling him, and telling them that it was a good thing that they would get this backlash, you could say, of all of these peoples by staying true to what Yeshua came to interpret, as we will see further down. Their life, the emissary's life, is a great example of these perseverance, right? Because they followed, and all of the things that they went through just because they followed Mashiach. They remained firm, they did not retreat, and they continued towards the goal and have a great reward in heaven, as Yeshua says. This exhorts and teaches us to remain in obedience and not to fear the reproach of the world, but to guard our salvation with fear and trembling, to receive the crown of life on that great day. As it says in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 12 to 15. Yeshua also tells us in verse 12 to rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For thus in the same way they persecute the prophets who were before you. Yeshua made it very clear that this persecution that was going on was definitely not the first time, and it was not something that just happened in their time because of Mashiach. In reality, as I just explained, Yeshua was seen more, was codified, you could say, was spoken about, was waited for in shadows of practices that the people of Israel had, that pointed to the time that Mashiach would come and pointed to his work that he would fulfill in this world. So therefore, that's why Yeshua came and ties in the prophets that came before the emissaries, who also believed in Mashiach and who also were persecuted. We can think about many of these great prophets like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, many of these prophets that truly were persecuted, but that they kept their eyes in the true promise. And we see, and again, Yeshua says that this is the price one pays for following the truth and following the Lamb wherever he goes, which is a life of consecration and obedience to the Eternal, will always be tested to see if we will be faithful to Adonai, or if we trust him, or if we just retaliate and go back to living our old life. So we see here how in Yeshua's words, not only did he get comfort, not only did he tell us what is the definition of a true blessed person in this world, but he also gave warnings about things that also come with all of this blessing, that also come with believing in the truth. And he himself was an example of that. From verse 13 to 16, Yeshua compares these believers, these people, these characteristics, this list that we have just read from verse 1 to 12, these believers who are considered truly blessed as the salt that in its essence purifies and gives flavor, and as the light that shines so bright that cannot be hidden. A true believer of the Mashiach must be the salt and light of this world, living in such a way that impacts the lives of those around them, being examples of obedience and holiness, consecration, purity, faith, and integrity. This teaches us that it is necessary that we bear fruit from the transformation that we say that we have received from our Mashiach and the instruction of the Eternal that has made a difference in our life, so that not only will it benefit our life first, but it will also be a benefit for those around us, to motivate them to do the same, right? Our testimony is truly what they will see and will have more weight when they see our life that has changed and for the good. If we are not born again with the regeneration of our understanding that occurs when we do teshuvah, or receiving the divine presence that comes into our lives, so we can listen and do the will of the Eternal, our life becomes a failure. Just like salt, if it loses its purifying ability, or the ability to be the flavor of this world, vanishes, or the light that is hidden and cannot illuminate others. So that's why we see how Yeshua compares a believer that loses his essence, where in the beginning of creation we were created to serve the Eternal, to be in his presence, but when that essence was tainted, then all of those who continue to be in the original sin as we know it, then they lose their essence. But we can regain it through the reconciliation that we have through Yeshua. And this is exactly the figures and the illustrations, very simple illustration that Yeshua uses to explain all of those processes. Therefore, it is essential that we be doers of the word and not only those who hear and forget, so that we may exalt the Father with our lives and can be testimonies of edification for those around us. From verse 17 to verse 20 says the following: "Do not think that I came to abolish the Torah or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Amen. I tell you, until heaven and earth passes away, not the smallest letter or serif or yud shall ever pass away from the Torah until all things come to pass. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, to one shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and Torah scholars, you shall never enter the kingdom of heaven." In Yeshua's own words, we are told that he did not come to abolish, that is, to get rid of, to eliminate, or to change the Torah, or any of the messages that the prophets gave. But he says that he came to fulfill it. All his teachings and all of those of the emissaries confirmed the instruction of the Almighty. And while they were on this earth, they fulfilled it fully, to the maximum. When the temple was destroyed and Yeshua was enthroned, the instructions regarding the sacrifices became invalid, since the delivery of the Mashiach replaced all those korbanot, as we know them as sacrifices. However, the other commandments that have to do with ethics, morality, loving our neighbors as ourselves, serving the eternal, justice, holiness, etc., are fully valid until the heavens and the earth pass. Moshe also places these two testimonies when the people of Israel were given the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19, and where it was said, where the Eternal told Israel in that moment to choose life or to choose death. He was putting those two options before them. This lets us know that whoever breaks these instructions that Yeshua came to give the interpretation is called the least in the kingdom. As we know, we already live in the kingdom established by Yeshua, composed by all those who believe and obey the Eternal. Therefore, we cannot settle in this world, cannot be lukewarm, neither doing nor teaching others to break these instructions, because if we do, then we will be rejected by the Eternal. This is exactly what the Pharisees and the Torah scholars of the times were teaching the people of Israel to do, disobeying the instruction of the Eternal and denying Mashiach because of their religious traditions and impositions upon the people. That's why Yeshua said, if our righteousness does not exceed man-made impositions or traditions or expectations that the systems of this world establishes, then we cannot inherit the kingdom of heaven. For what does righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Yeshua and Belial? Or what does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? As we see this reference in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 from verse 14 to 15. Therefore, we must persevere with an obedient heart and life, not deviating from the instruction given by Elohim, for we are being tested, and the Eternal will judge our works and determine whether or not we are approved to inherit the eternal mansions. And well, from here until the end of the chapter, we will understand and see how Yeshua explains and gives the correct interpretation regarding different commandments that were given from the time of the Torah. From verse 21 to 26, talks about murder specifically. But in verse 21 to 22 says the following: "You have heard that it was said that to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subjected to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subjected to judgment. Anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the courts. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger in the fire of Gehinnom, or in English it's called hell. When Yeshua says, "You've heard as it was said to the people of long ago," it clarifies that Yeshua is not giving a new law, but rather teaching the correct interpretation of the commandment. In this case, he talks about murder and goes to the central point, or the spirit of the commandment given in the Torah, because certainly everything begins with an anger or bad desires or intentions against one's neighbor in the heart. It all stems from the heart. From the moment one begins to have negative feelings, one is already on the way to death. Therefore, Yeshua teaches us to avoid anger, offenses, and conflict, and to seek peace and reconciliation with those, so as not to even get into a fight, as Psalms 37 verse 8 to 9 says. But Yeshua takes it further in verse 23 and 24 and says that if a believer is angry or has a problem with a brother, sister, or neighbor, they must first resolve their differences and reconcile before offering any service before the Eternal. That in their case, in that time, it was the sacrifices to the temple that the Eternal was going to accept. This teaches us that if we wish to serve the Eternal truly and our service be accepted, we must also strive to be at peace with those around us. And if we have a problem with someone, to be mature enough to speak about it and to fix it before coming to serve the Eternal. And again, these are things that I know are very difficult, but with the Eternal's help, it is possible. From verse 27 to 32, Yeshua talks about a very important commandment given to humanity, and that is the topic about adultery and divorce. Two matters that are very controversial in the religious world, and one that as young believers need to have a complete understanding about its responsibilities and implications. In verse 27 and 28 says the following: "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery,' but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Yeshua, our Mashiach, speaks about adultery and explains that from the moment greed is born or springs up in the heart towards a person who is not the spouse, adultery is already committed. Adultery, in this case, does not start from a sexual encounter, but from the moment that bad intention is nurtured in the heart, that is, in the mind, which is why it is considered a betrayal. Therefore, Yeshua urges us to be radical and firmly cut off everything that makes us fall emotionally, physically, and in any other way we may transgress against the Eternal. And that's why Yeshua teaches us that in this context, we see that he teaches us that the problem is the heart. And from there, we must begin to work by removing all the bad desires and inclinations that we may have and submitting ourselves to the will of the Eternal, being faithful to him and our spouse. If the person is married or this topic pertains to them. In verse 31 and 32, Yeshua says the following: "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Yeshua clarifies that this separation that happens between a man and a woman who are under oath, known as the divorce, is something man-made unless the union was broken due to adultery. In chapter 15 of Matthew, Yeshua adds more details about this topic, and he said that divorce happens mainly because of the hardness of the human heart. It is stubborn and set on satisfying one's flesh, because in the beginning of the creation, it was not so. The Eternal created the union so that it lasts until death pulls the spouses away, and the Eternal is displeased when it is dissolved. For this is a sacred union that teaches us how the Eternal is faithful to his vows as well. He made the vows that he made with Israel and to those who live a righteous life. And the Eternal wants us to also be able to keep our vows to the fullest, unless, of course, infidelity or adultery is committed. Then there is a valid reason. We will circle back to this topic in detail in chapter 19. From verse 33 to 37, Yeshua gives instructions about oaths and explains the correct interpretation of the commandments not to swear falsely. In the Torah, we find several commandments that talk about this aspect. For example, Leviticus chapter 29, verse 12, Numbers 30, verse 2, Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 21 to 22 talks about all of these commandments that have to do with oaths or vows. So we know from our study from the Torah that a vow is one of the 5 ways that we give to the Eternal, known as nadar, which means to vow, to promise, to do something for the Eternal, as we saw in the Torah. Making oaths is not a commandment, but the Eternal does not require us to do them. But if a person decides to make an oath to him, then the person has the obligation to fulfill them to the max. The Father takes it into account what comes out of our mouth seriously. And if a person makes a promise or an oath to him, then he or she should not retract from it. It is important that we learn this very important lesson, because we must be careful and responsible to be faithful to the words that come out of our mouths. For example, we have Jethro, which we see his story in Judges chapter 11 from chapter 11 verse 1 all the way to chapter 12 verse 7 in the book of Judges. And in his example and what happened to this man, we can understand the central point of what Mashiach teaches. And to recap what happened was that Jephthah was made a vow to the Eternal that if the Eternal gave him victory, that he would sacrifice the first person that would come out of his house. And unfortunately, it was his daughter. So although he had good intentions when making his vow, he did not think about the consequences, but rather let himself be carried away by the emotion of the moment. And although he actually did it, he actually fulfilled his vow, he later regretted having done so, which is why Yeshua says that it is better not to swear. But the problem is not making a vow. It is, again, what stems here, or the problem that we see here about the swearing, is not so much about making the vow, making that oath, but it's because of the hardness of man's heart, which is inconsistent, and who only promises with words without conviction in the heart, leads them to not fulfill their vows, and that is what makes them fall in transgression before the Eternal. When we don't fulfill our word. And this is interesting because the Pharisees, on their part, were teaching in that time that if someone was really going to commit to fulfilling his promise, he should swear by the name of the Eternal. But that if he was not going to fulfill his promise, he should swear by heaven and earth or Jerusalem. And thus, that person could break his oath. Yeshua was totally opposed to this hypocrisy, to those who shared and lived according to these teachings, which acted falsely and fell into another transgression, which is lying. That's why Yeshua said that the believer's yes is a yes and no should be a no. The person who commits to the Eternal and is convicted of it does not need to swear. He or she is simply going to fulfill it, having a firm decision, not driven by an emotion, but because of conviction. And the same applies to our neighbor. We do not need to swear to someone by the Eternal that we will do something, but we must just act in sincerity, firmness, integrity, and having coherence between what we say and what we do. Yeshua said in John chapter 8, verse 44, that Satan, his adversary, is the father of lies, and that he has lied from the beginning by twisting the truth and has not kept his word. So anyone who does the same is the adversary's fruit, is the adversary's child, you could say. And well, from this we're gonna from verse 38 to 42, again Yeshua cites a text from the Torah to give it a correct interpretation about what it means eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. We find this instruction several times. For example, it's cited in Exodus chapter 21, verse 24, Leviticus 24, verse 20, Deuteronomy 19, verse 21. And as we have studied it already in the Torah series, it deals with the aspect of restitution, known as the laws of retaliation. Yeshua makes the clarification because apparently it was being interpreted literally, in the sense that if someone caused harm to his neighbor, he simply returned what is fair. What is fair? For example, if he harmed one sheep, he would return another, and that's it. But Yeshua's teaching instructs us to go further, to go the extra mile. That if we unintentionally caused harm to another person, we will repay them with excellence. That our attitude can cause a favorable impact on their lives of the other person that we have done, that we have unintentionally harmed, achieving a change in their attitude as well. And in this way, we can also be salt and light of this world, demonstrating that we are children of the Eternal. In verse 43, it emphasizes, you have heard it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Although this was taught orally, the Torah does not say it in this way. In Leviticus 19, verse 18 says the following, do not seek revenge or bear any grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as love yourself. I am the Eternal. The Eternal had given very clear instructions to Israel, but the Pharisees and other religious leaders taught to act in a very different way. For them, their neighbors were only the Jews, or only the Israelites. Other people were considered Gentiles, enemies, and they felt completely free to hate them. And we see the same concept today. There is data that in the Babylonian Talmud, or the oral Torah as they know it, the people of the nations were considered as animals. But Yeshua gives the correct interpretation from verse 44 to 48. Specifically in verse 44 and 45, that says, but I tell you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. These instructions are very forceful, that aims directly to our ego. As humans, when we are harmed or feel disrespected, our primary reaction is usually anger, because the harm really hurts and we suffer it and we want justice. But Yeshua, our Mashiach, teaches us not to take justice into our own hands, not to seek revenge. On the contrary, we must deny ourselves, forgive, not repay evil for evil, but bless and pray for those who hurt us and do good to them if they need our help. In my personal experience, I know that as young people, this is not an easy thing to do. But if we try doing this without the help of the Father, we honestly could not. We need to make a conscious and willing decision to do it, even though our emotions are telling us otherwise. It is necessary for us to hand over our burdens to the Eternal so he may employ his justice, and we do not hold any grudges, resentments, or bitterness in our hearts or our lives, because they make our body and minds sick and contaminated in the interior. When we obey in this way, we also reflect the character of our Father. because throughout Scripture, we have seen how he has shown his mercy, his patience, and benevolence towards humanity. We must always remember that we ourselves were shown love, mercy, and favor from the Almighty, and when we recognize this wonderful truth, we decide to be different and demonstrate to Elohim our gratitude of this new life he gives us by acting in the same way, giving of what we have received. In conclusion, Yeshua's instructions for Israel and for us as believers is that we recognize our need of Elohim to obey his instruction with the right spirit and teaching, so we may live a fullness in his presence and reconciliation through his son Yeshua. We know that these very instructions still apply to us today because after Yeshua ascended to the celestial dwellings, his disciples and emissaries took this message to all the world, and we see it reflected in the letters to Paul. We see it reflected in the letters that Paul, or known as Shaul, wrote to various communities of believers that believed in the Torah and in Mashiach, who lived in the diaspora, and in these communities, it was composed of both Israelites and people that believed in the Torah and believed in Mashiach. They came from the Gentiles or from the nations. In Romans chapter 12, verse 17 to 21, gives us a great detail about all of these things that we've seen in the teachings of Yeshua. It says, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my brothers, but leave room for Elohim's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says Adonai. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." This is the correct conduct in which we as believers are expected to live by and being tamim, which in Hebrew is the word for being a person who is whole, entire, sound, healthful, integrity, complete, and mature. This is the standard that the Eternal expects of us, that we be imitators of his Son, that we remove the ego from our hearts, and that we may live to please him and not to ourselves. And well, brothers and sisters, this is all for today's study. Thank you so much for your attention. And if the Eternal permits, we shall see you in another video. Shalom.